Welcome to The Focused View, the podcast for eye care professionals across Australia. Brought to you by Opticare. In each episode, we bring together leading eye care, optical and business professionals to share valuable insights, practical tips, and the latest trends shaping the optical business landscape. I'm your host, Michael Nasser, and together we'll explore innovative strategies for practice growth, patient care, and business success in the eye care industry. Whether you're starting your career, managing a practice, or just looking to stay ahead of the field, The Focused View is your source for inspiration and knowledge. In today's episode, we're excited to kick off the first part of a two-part series focusing on emotional intelligence, a pivotal skill for modern leadership. Joining us is Dr. Bethany Fishbein, an optometrist and distinguished expert in emotional intelligence training from New Jersey. Dr. Fishbein has made significant contributions to leadership development within the healthcare sector, especially in optometry, through her work with leaders of vision. Today, we'll delve into the essence of emotional intelligence, exploring why it's vital for effective leadership and how it enhances decision-making, conflict resolution, and team dynamics. This two-part series will not only introduce you to the fundamentals of emotional intelligence, but it will also explore its practical application through real-world examples and my personal emotional intelligence journey. If you're a leader looking to enhance your influence and effectiveness, this series is crafted for you. So let's get into it. Bethany, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, we're very excited to have you as well. And to help introduce the audience to yourself, can you start by telling us a bit about you and I guess how you've ended up doing what you're doing today?
Yeah, I am an optometrist. Finished optometry school, met my husband in school. We opened a practice together in New Jersey in the US in 2001, grew that, and now are part owners of two practices that are growing and doing well. But about 15 years ago, I started practice management consulting. And over the time that I was consulting, really started to realize that the practice owners that were doing the best were the ones who were focused on their leadership skills. And so in the past year, I've really keyed in on that, becoming a certified executive coach and emotional intelligence practitioner, and working with leaders to help them become better leaders, build stronger teams.
Yeah. I think what makes it so unique and you so unique is the fact that you're obviously an optometrist, and so you understand the business of optometry better than most. And on top of that, there's obviously that business sort of component to your thinking, it seems, and that's led you to this path of being a consultant and then tying that in with emotional intelligence, which is effectively what we're talking about today and its role in leadership. I think there are some really, really cool ingredients there that have come together to be quite unique and quite diverse. And I know in the conversations we've had to date, it's, been really interesting and, learning a lot about this. And I think it's a topic area that I'm really excited about. So yeah, I think if we start to get into the nuts and bolts of emotional intelligence with reference to leadership and with reference to optometry and optometry business too, I think that's really what we're honing in on today. Can you start by defining what emotional intelligence is?
Sure. So emotional intelligence, and sometimes you'll hear this called EI or EQ, all the same thing, is really the ability to understand and to manage your own feelings, your own emotions, and also to recognize the emotions in others and be able to respond appropriately.
It's probably an area that not most would think about at first instance when it comes to leadership, I would imagine. And in light of that, why do you think it's so critical for leaders?
I think it's really the ingredient that separates the most successful leaders from the leaders who are frustrated by having to lead and manage. So ultimately, leaders, or within the optometric context, optometry practice owners, are responsible for the performance of their office. And they're also responsible for creating and building the culture in the office, which is how it feels for people to go to work. So they've got a big responsibility on their shoulders. And to get there, they can't do it all themselves. They're relying on a team. And so the leader and the team are all experiencing different emotions and feelings all day long. And we know that the way people feel is going to influence the decisions they make, the way that they behave, whether they're being productive working towards the goals of the organization or against it, and ultimately how they perform. So knowing that the leader has to set this culture and get the performance they want out of their team, understanding people's emotions and developing this emotional intelligence lets the leader bring their best self to work and get the most out of the people that they're working with.
And would you say that, I mean, emotional intelligence, I guess, in some way or shape is happening naturally, right? Like, I mean, in the actions that a leader of a practice would be conducting, it automatically is happening by default. Because another word that you mentioned there was culture. And do you feel that with your experience, what you've seen, is it something that you see happen naturally without much thought, or are you seeing people become more aware of this type of thought process and this type of, I guess, category?
I think both, to be fair. So whether you're aware or not, whether you like it or not, as a leader, or even as a member of a team, emotional intelligence is happening all day long in every interaction you have with someone else, even an interaction that you have with your patients. Understanding how a patient feels when they're coming in. Are they scared? Are they angry? Are they looking for a fight? Are they, anxious about something that has nothing to do with your office? Being able to read and understand that emotion lets you modify how you're taking care of them to get the best results from them too, right? To get them to agree to a treatment plan, to understand what you're recommending, to follow up, know they need to go to a specialist, whatever the things are. So this is something that optometrists are dealing with all day long, whether they like it or not.
Yeah.
The decision to accept and embrace that this is something that you can get better at is a conscious one. I've met leaders who feel they're bad at this. They say, I have the emotional intelligence of a rock. Rocks are pretty good listeners. I'm just saying, no, but they just assume that some people are naturally good and naturally bad. And I think that's true. Some people just seem to have that intuition, but everybody can learn where their own strengths or weaknesses are and use those to get even stronger.
Yeah, I think one of the key words that you said there was the knowledge of it, basically, or the understanding of it. It is happening. It's that recognition of it as a concept, and then how you, I guess, choose to work with it. Because once you become conscious, I think that was the word you used, being conscious of it, it then allows you to perhaps be, I guess strategic may not be the right word, but it might allow you to notify or see areas that, you can improve on, or why things perhaps may be the way that they are. And I think that's a really important point. What do you see as the relationship between emotional intelligence and empathy, or being empathetic? Because that's a lot of sort of what I'm hearing to this point. It's, as you mentioned, understanding, your customers and your staff, are they closely aligned?
Yeah, I think empathy is one of the core pieces of emotional intelligence. The ability to understand what others are feeling, and then the ability to change your style to match what might be most effective to them. So I don't think that empathy encompasses all of emotional intelligence. There's other pieces to it, like understanding your own feelings and how those affect how you're communicating with your team.
Yeah.
Being able to combine the emotions with the facts and figures to make decisions, being able to manage your own emotions. You can be aware that they're there, and then you have to choose to do something about them. Being able to act to influence others, all of those things go into emotional intelligence, but empathy is certainly a big one.
Yeah, it's just something that comes to mind, which is why I brought it up at that point. I guess if we're looking at EI, as you've referred to emotional intelligence, or EI, and I'll refer to it as that, I'm sure, from time to time, some of the effects that it can have on one once they recognize it. In your experience, have you seen it change a leader's approach to, say, conflict resolution or, moments of difficulty?
I think what it can do is change the type of conflicts that a leader is sometimes dealing with. So understanding this, in my experience, really takes a leader from being kind of baffled all the time. Why are people the way they are? How come it feels like people don't like me? Why can't I get them to do, what I need them to do? To putting them more in control of this and saying, okay, what do I need to do to get these results from my team? So, like you gave the example of conflict resolution, I think a leader with strong emotional intelligence is dealing with far fewer conflicts than a leader without that, because somebody who's attuned to the way that others are feeling is going to pick up a conflict situation when it's tiny. They just feel like something's off. They have the wherewithal to recognize it and the skills to say, what's going on today? And it might just be something very little that they can listen to and respond appropriately, and the issue goes away. So they can understand it, they can fix it. Where somebody on the other side who is not tuned into this and can't see things from another perspective might miss the small conflict completely, and all of a sudden they're dealing with something that's blown up to the point that they can't avoid it anymore, which in most cases is a much harder job and much less likely to get to a positive resolution.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And can you discuss in some capacity the impact of emotional intelligence on a leader's ability to manage stress? Because I guess, we're in that age where everyone seems to be stressed out with things, and there's so much to do and so little time. And, if you're managing a team and you've got all these things, I mean, how does the recognition and the conscious awareness of emotional intelligence and the ability to understand it, affect stress and the ability to manage it?
I think it's partly about managing stress, but same thing, like somebody who has a tough time with emotional intelligence and isn't able to be emotionally intelligent most of the time is going to just have more stress to deal with, because they're creating a culture where people are stressed and anxious all the time, which might be their team stress, their own stress, and it kind of feeds on itself. Like they're constantly frustrated. So I think that when somebody can understand the emotions of their team and they can understand their own emotions, they can pause for a minute and think about where their stress is coming from. I'm feeling this. Why am I feeling that? And maybe they realize in that moment it's something that they don't have any control over and they're able to get through that. Or maybe they realize it's because of something that could be very easily fixed, right? I'm really frustrated because every time the person at the front desk picks up the phone, she doesn't say her name, and I've asked her to say her name. Okay, like this is why I'm frustrated. Let's have a productive conversation and eliminate the frustration, which is going to decrease the level of stress.
Yeah.
In tough cases, I've met, and honestly, I've even been a practice owner who sometimes just in tough times, like feels like I'm on an island and the team is working against me. And that makes it tough to even want to go into work, which is really stressful, right? This is for optometrists who've opened practices. They've done it to gain a certain degree of freedom. And when you have that and you don't even want to go there, that's an incredible level of stress. But in most cases, that's avoidable, or when it's not fully avoidable, it's improvable or correctable.
Yeah. And that's what I love about it. And when we mention stress, obviously, the stress obviously comes in many forms. We're speaking with reference to the stress that the store can bring, and that could be, the number of patients that are coming through, or like you've alluded to, how the front of staff are answering the phone call, or maybe there's a cleanliness aspect that's not being done, or small little things that eventually add up. And I feel like the significance of understanding emotional intelligence, like you've mentioned there, is you can recognize that, and then you can say, well, how can we manage that? How can we improve that? And the sooner that recognition is made, I think hopefully the better off for everyone, because then that stems back to culture and back to all of those things that we're sort of speaking to. We touched on it briefly, but I did want to come back to it. The key components of emotional intelligence. Again, I mentioned empathy earlier on, and we spoke about a few other things, but I guess if you were to try and summarize it as best as possible, what do you see as the main components of emotional intelligence? How are they formed, and how has this category evolved, basically?
So empathy and the awareness of others is certainly a big one, and that's one that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
I think one of the other big categories is that self-awareness, which is just understanding what you're putting out there and the behaviors you're demonstrating and the impact that your behavior has on other people. And that's super important. I think that one of the other keys is authenticity, which is just being able to be your true self at work, being able to express yourself openly and being not only true to yourself, but showing that you're true to yourself in the commitments that you make to others, like that people can trust you not only to be who you say you are, but to do the things that you say you're going to do. I think emotional reasoning is a key, and that's the combination of feelings and all of the facts when you're making a decision. So sometimes people are just all fact-based and not worrying about how people feel. Sometimes they're all gut instinct feeling-based and not worrying about the facts. And both of those can be more frustrating for a team than somebody who has a better balance. And the two others, I think one is self-management or self-regulation, which is managing your own mood and your own emotions and being able to present your best self, and also always wanting to be better. That's a huge difference that I see. And the last is being aware of and working on the influence that you have on others. Can you inspire other people to be their best? That's a super important characteristic of emotional intelligence, especially for people in leadership roles. And they're all kind of interconnected. You can hear in the description of one bits of another, and it's all part of this complex emotional being that we are.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. It is complex. It does speak to the category in so many ways, and there is so much intertwining. One of the ones that you've mentioned that sort of resonates with me is, or that sort of jumped out to me, was the self-awareness aspect. How have you seen self-awareness affect a leader's performance? And I guess the context of that and performance, how do you see them linking?
Yeah, when I work with a team, this is one of the huge ones that comes up, because if self-awareness is understanding and being able to see the impact that the things you do have on other people, leaders who struggle very often lack self-awareness. And when they can't see the impact that their actions have on somebody else, they just keep doing the same thing over and over and over with the same negative response from the team, and they don't even realize it's happening. So an example like where I see this is a leader I worked with who was really frustrated by his team meetings to the point that he stopped having them. And there was something he wanted to do. And I said, okay, you need to have a meeting. And he said, I'm not having meetings. Meetings are stupid. I sit there, I ask for ideas, and they all just look at me blankly and nobody says anything. So I'm frustrated by meetings. Clearly the staff doesn't want to be there. I have to make all the decisions myself anyway. What we saw through some work is that when he held meetings, as soon as somebody would give an idea, he was shutting it down immediately, and in a way that was coming across a little bit condescending. It made the person who had the idea feel stupid for even venturing to share something. So somebody feels that once, they're not going to say anything the next time. They're like, okay, I guess that's what happens when I share an idea. So I'm just not going to share it. And now the leader is struggling because he feels alone, like the team doesn't care. They're not willing to help. He's figuring out every bit of the business. They're angry about it because he's not taking any of their needs into consideration because they're not speaking up. And it creates this cycle of low performance because the leader initially wasn't able to see how his response to the ideas or suggestions was creating a really negative experience for the person who gave them, to the point they never wanted to give one again.
When you hear it put like that, the criticalness of it is so evident. That ability to recognize that is so powerful, because obviously, as you've mentioned with the example there, that optometrist and that leader of that store probably didn't recognize what they were doing. And there was a problem evolving as a result of those actions that he wasn't conscious of. And it was just leading him down a spiral. And I'm assuming, not knowing how it ended up, but once he was able to recognize that and be self-aware as to how he was conducting himself in that environment, it would have led to I imagine a small change. It might have been a bit bigger for him perhaps, and then some positivity would come back from that relatively quickly.
Yeah. And, in this case, he was blaming his staff. They don't come up with any ideas. And then the staff would leave and there would be new staff. And lo and behold, they didn't come up with any ideas either. No. Yeah. And then, it just kept perpetuating itself. So becoming aware of it and then figuring out strategies. How do I respond differently in a meeting? And learning to run an effective brainstorming session. All of a sudden, the team is participating. It took a little while, but it's like, wait a minute, maybe it wasn't them all along, which it wasn't. Yeah. And now all of a sudden, the current team is doing much better.
Yeah, and it just speaks to the power of what this has the potential to do when you are leading a team, when you are in those positions of influence, and how that resonates with everyone. When you look at emotional intelligence, half of that term is emotional, and the emotion. Can you explain the importance of self-regulation in maintaining team morale, especially when it comes to, the emotional aspect? And I guess when we speak about self-regulation, it's probably more in the context of sometimes we can get frustrated about things and then we become emotional. And you hear it often, people will be like, they're very emotional. Do you feel like self-regulation is important in that regard? And I guess in the context of emotional intelligence, how that helps with team morale?
Yeah, super important. And these are all super important. So I'm going to say that about all of them.
Yeah.
But the idea of self-regulation, think about this in the context of a patient, because patients, maybe they're not like this in Australia, but in the US, patients can be frustrating. They come in late. They don't understand anything about what they're doing. They're concerned about the pricing. Sometimes they're not treating your staff well. They're not treating you well. They're not treating your family well. And you're super frustrated with them. And if you had a staff member who met them back with that same frustration, you would be absolutely horrified, right? Somebody comes in late and the staff member says, well, if you're late like this, we're going to rush your exam. You would be horrified, right? So we're expecting a level of emotional self-regulation from our teams. And then we have to be able as leaders to show that ourselves. Where I see that one come up a lot is when leaders are concerned about the state of their business. Maybe they're frustrated at a situation with a staff member, maybe like the business isn't doing well and they're concerned about the finances. Am I going to be able to pay my bills? Or a manager's concerned they're not performing. They're concerned about their own job. They're feeling a little bit frantic, like things are feeling kind of out of control. And so without recognizing it, sometimes they start to respond by trying to control everything. So they're panicked and frantic and it's coming across and they're all in somebody's business, over controlling and micromanaging, and the team doesn't understand where that's coming from. So they start to kind of rebel against it, which makes the leader even more frustrated. And it's a miserable day where they can learn to regulate that panic or that frustration, just like we learn to regulate it with patients. So they can do it and be able to express concern appropriately or express frustration appropriately. Not that they have to pretend they don't feel it, because that comes across too in tone and in body movement, body language, nonverbal communication. But to really say, okay, this patient maybe is fighting something I know nothing about. I'm going to just give them all the grace in the world. Let me make this the best part of their day. And learning to do the same for the staff yields super high performance results.
Yeah, makes sense. Something that you mentioned was communication and nonverbal communication. How do you see them linking with emotional intelligence? And can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think the thing that a lot of people sometimes don't realize is that your nonverbal communication very often betrays your true emotional state. So sometimes people learning about this for the first time try to, quote, be better by saying words they don't mean. So if they're terrified because the business is doing well, they feel like, okay, I know I can't show that emotion, so I better say something like, oh, guys, don't even worry, the business is great. And people can see right through that. They hear it in the tone of voice. They see the facial expressions. So it's not about being someone else. It's about being able to express yourself, what you're really feeling, in a healthy way. A leader can say, I'm scared, I'm anxious, I'm frustrated. They're allowed to be all of those things. What they can't or shouldn't say is, oh my God, guys, I don't know what we're going to do. If we can't do this, I'm not going to meet payroll. We're going to go down, because that just incites panic. So how can they learn to say, okay, we've had a rough couple of weeks and we really need a turnaround. Yeah. So what I've thought about to get there is, and present their fear, their anxiety in a healthier, solution-focused way that doesn't create panic.
Yeah, and that probably comes back to that self-regulation aspect too, I would imagine, in your nonverbal cues as well as your verbal communication. So I think there's a lot of symmetry with those two aspects. And drawing back on a few of the things you said, like meetings, for example, is one big area that people, a lot of this stuff comes out in, because we're in that situation where we're all observing one another. But I know it's sometimes as simple as the way someone looks. It could be just the eye movements. It could just be looking away when, so it is quite complex. And I feel like as a leader or as somebody that's part of leading a team there, you need to be aware of all of those aspects and be mindful of those. And I guess, that's part of the skill set that we are speaking about here with regards to all of this. We touched on empathy slightly. I wanted to get your opinion on empathy and the role that it plays with building strong teams and the relationships within team members. How have you seen that play out in context of, say, some of the practices you've worked in?
I mean, this is probably the strongest piece in building team relationships. And, we're saying team relationships, but it's not just workplace relationships we're talking about.
Yeah.
It's relationships with your partner, with your children, with people you encounter out in the community. So this is about building relationships to begin with. And so I think the thing to understand is what the perception is of somebody who's showing strong empathy versus someone who is not showing empathy. And so let's say a boss or a leader who's good at empathy is caring. They're invested in someone's success. They're well connected with their team. They're looking out for you. Somebody without empathy is perceived as the exact opposite, somebody who's uncaring, insensitive, and people don't want to work with or for someone that they perceive to be uncaring or insensitive. And these things, somebody picking up on this, it affects how they perceive someone on their team, sometimes for the entire duration of their employment. I remember being in a meeting, and it wasn't a meeting, it was a dinner, it was informal, and there was a new team member that was there, and his supervisor was asking him about something, and you could just see him getting visibly upset at the way that his supervisor was asking questions. And it wasn't about work performance. It wasn't about anything related. It wasn't not related to work, but it wasn't about like the specific office or the job. It was about his perceptions of leadership and teamwork in a totally different situation. So he's like starting to freak out a little bit. And you see him non-verbally kind of backing up and starting to give answers like, I don't think talking about this anymore is going to really make a difference. And the leader she missed it and kept hammering the questions. And so now this guy is feeling attacked and super uncomfortable. And eventually somebody else at the table said, enough, let's talk about something else. Let's give this guy a break. And so it was like the person who didn't realize she was hammering with questions said, oh, why'd we stop? And the person who was being hammered with questions ultimately walked out of that dinner in tears. No. And it was just such a mismatch. And what happened from that is months later, the person who had felt attacked had a question. He was uncertain about something, and he should have gone to his direct supervisor to ask. And he didn't. He skipped her, went to her boss because it just didn't feel comfortable for him to walk into an uncertain conversation with her.
Yeah.
And, the boss said, why aren't you talking to the person you should be talking to? And he said, I don't know. This just like felt safer. If that goes on and you don't know about it, that can ultimately affect somebody's ability or desire to stay in a job.
Yeah. And I think a lot of what you're speaking to as well, in and amongst the listeners that are listening to this, I'm sure there have been situations in the workplace where some of the things that we've spoken about with regards to, that story or the other ones, they're probably like, oh, I know about a situation like that, or I felt something similar, or I know what you're speaking about there, and it makes total sense because, as I touched on at the beginning, I feel like this is something that happens obviously naturally. The conscious awareness of it then enables you to sort of say, well, now I kind of know why, or now I can understand why. Now I'm starting to see this picture. And that's what makes the topic, I believe, so powerful, because you can identify with these things and people will, because they're invariably happening in one way or another. It's just, are you conscious of it or are you not? And I guess what we're kind of getting at is the more conscious you are of it, the hopefully better that you can be. In light of that, when it comes to managers and leaders developing emotional intelligence or enhancing their emotional intelligence, what are some methods that they can adopt to develop their emotional intelligence in that regard?
There's so much out there. I mean, if you Google emotional intelligence, there are books and websites and podcasts all specifically about this. So sometimes just reading and listening to these as part of your own development is a start. It's something that as people hear about, some people can see these things in themselves right away. Some people don't see it in themselves, so they start to recognize it in other people. But it's taking that little moment of self-reflection when something doesn't go the way you think it's going to go, or somebody doesn't respond the way you thought they were going to. And parents of young kids do this all the time. Like, what happened there? That was supposed to be a happy time, and why are we having a tantrum? And you have to go back and look at yourself to see, were there signs along the way that maybe you missed? Was there something different you could have done? Very rarely is something happening totally randomly. But I do think that somebody can work to develop this a little bit more formally. And as you know, I've found great value in an assessment that asks not only the leader for feedback about themselves, because although that's important, very often people who don't have real great emotional intelligence can't accurately know how they're being perceived by others. So an assessment that's asking people around the leader to give specific feedback on how they see different emotionally intelligent behaviors demonstrated can give the leader a ton of information about how they're coming across to others, because they can think that they're incredibly empathetic.
Yeah.
But if their team doesn't see that, it doesn't really matter what they think about themselves. It is still a problem.
Yeah, and you've touched on something that we'll be speaking about at a later time, which is, the actual assessment of one and how we can develop this emotional intelligence and recognize it. But a key thing that I wanted to draw on at this point was, the difference that you've just mentioned there is what you potentially think that you have or are and what your team actually see you as can be sometimes two very separate things. And I think there's a lot of value in understanding that. And I guess, when we talk about the assessment, and I know the assessment and I've actually undertaken it with regards to what it's like, I see exactly where that comes from and how that can actually help. So we don't want to give away too much in that instance because I think we've got more to talk about. Are there specific challenges leaders face while working to enhance their emotional intelligence that you've seen? So does it sometimes do anything detrimental? Can it be counterproductive, or what are some of those challenges that you see?
I don't think it's counterproductive ever. But one challenge that I see is that some leaders, and these are usually the ones who need to do the work the most, struggle to understand why working on this is important. So these are those leaders, practice owners that are very results driven, and they're focused on the numbers and the metrics. And so they can feel like all this talking about feelings at work feels counterproductive. So the challenge for them is really to understand and embrace the idea that the way people feel at work is what drives those numbers, so that working on their emotional intelligence often is the key that they've been missing to influence the results that they've been frustrated by. So that's one of the big challenges. And another is just that this is hard work.
Yeah.
It requires a level of vulnerability. And you shared that you did the assessment. And I know when you did it, the period of time between when you send this out and when you're waiting for it to come back is tense. Like, it's not what people are used to, especially people who are company owners. They're not used to having people question them or share their thoughts about them most of the time. And so they have to be ready for that level of vulnerability.
Yeah, and I think it's an important distinction to make at this point. In our industry, and I'm sure it's the same over there with regards to how it works. We've got corporate and we've got independents. And, the corporates are part of large chains, whether it's Luxottica, whether it's, the various groups that are out there that are part of some type of corporatized business, which has a lot of these tools. And that could be at a retail or at a wholesale level. The bigger companies, they generally have a lot of these tools in and amongst what they do. When we're talking I'm an independent business owner effectively, and I know that a lot of the people that we speak to are independent business owners, and it's those, you touched on the fact that they could be a company owner. And so if they're at the top of the company, then very rarely are they getting questioned or challenged, or is there a perspective being shared, or are they open to other perspectives? And so I think there, like you said, there's that element of vulnerability, and that's perhaps the people that can maybe benefit from it the most too, because it is that person in that environment that can change. In a corporate setting, so much of the culture and the tone and the structure is not set by a particular person. It might be somebody from head office that's in another city, another state, another area, and that's all trickling down. But when you're talking about small independent businesses, invariably the business owner can make some pretty monumental changes if they can harness the power of, I guess, the things that we're talking about.
For sure. And the great thing in a small company is that making those changes, the results are felt and seen often immediately.
Yeah. We've spoken about the assessment, and we'll talk more about that in a later episode. But how can leaders, let's assume that they don't want to do an assessment, or maybe they just do some light reading about the topic and listen to a few things. Again, this podcast could be an example. How can they just start to measure improvements in their emotional intelligence from now? Let's say they've recognized that they want to identify a few things. Maybe let's just say empathy, that's a pretty common thing. They want to work on that. Are there ways to measure that in the context of being able to look back on it? Because I feel like it's almost like a continual thing. It's not something that ever ends either.
No, it is a continual thing. And people are constantly being really good and really bad. And the goal is just to shift to be really good at this more often, right? A greater percentage of the time.
Yeah.
So I think if leaders can recognize maybe something they've been frustrated by, they can use that as a barometer to measure change over time. So if, let's say, a leader is giving instructions and the people they give the instructions to just never seem to understand the instructions clearly, then changing how they're giving instructions if they're getting better feedback from people who say, okay, got it, the first time, instead of saying, wait a minute, I have no clue what you're talking about. That's a metric that tells them that they're getting better at their communication. Or if people are responding the way you think that they should. The other thing that you can do is work on this with other people. Because if you, let's say you're listening to this and you say, I really am not super aware of how other people are feeling, and maybe I need to work on my empathy. If you have a partner or a manager and you share with them that you're working on this, trust me, if you figured it out about yourself, they already know it about you. So you're not telling them something they don't know or showing weakness. You're showing strength by being ready to deal with it. And when you let the people who care about you know what you're working on, they're generally going to be supportive. And so they can give you feedback in that moment. And sometimes people have done this, again, not even at work, but with a husband or a wife. And they tell them, I feel like I'm not as good at reading other people's emotions as I could be. And the wife will say something like, duh, right? Because they know.
I know.
And then having that conversation invites in the next social interaction to have a little bit of feedback on, yeah, you know how you were doing that? I think you totally missed how he was feeling there. And it's got to be, like I said, somebody you love or care about or trust, and they've got to be able to deliver it gently and have the emotional intelligence to do so.
I think there's definitely a lot of value in collaborating and sharing that with people. I feel like you said, they already know probably what you've started to recognize. Yeah, you've got to be careful you're picking the right people to do this with, because I feel like it does also perhaps open the opportunity for people to maybe take it a little bit too far. But yes. I think in the right hands, a husband or a wife or somebody that's very close to you that, wants to see you improve too, I feel, that's got to be there or thereabouts.
Yeah. And even sometimes working on this with a group at work. So if there are like a practice that has several locations, the managers of each location working on this together can be kind of a support group for each other, which helps as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess so as we wrap up today's conversation, based on the discussions that we've had, I mean, there are so many gold nuggets in there, and there are so many, pieces of information there that can be taken away and I think, really developed with regards to the people listening to this today. But what would be some of those most critical takeaways about emotional intelligence, that you want leaders to remember in this podcast? What would be some take homes from that regard?
I think the two biggest take homes, number one is just that this is important, maybe the most important competency for a leader who wants to communicate effectively, to build trust with their teams and have great results in their business. So the takeaway is this is important, this counts. And I think the second takeaway is that it can be improved. Even though some people have stronger natural abilities and some just don't, like anything else, it is a skill that can be improved with practice and work.
Yeah. Awesome. Can you give us a bit of a sneak peek into how some of these emotional intelligence principles will be applied? I guess in our next episode, a bit of a scenario with regards to the assessment that I undertook for that next episode, just so the listeners can start to think about what that may be and some of those principles that we're working on.
Sure. The idea that this can be improved if you're willing to do the work. Next time, I think we're really talking about what doing the work looks like. So how can a leader see their specific strengths and how can they see their specific weaknesses? And then once they have that information, what can they do about it? So coming up next.
Yeah, love it. Well, thank you so much for your time, Bethany. I really enjoyed this topic. It's probably something I could talk about for hours because I feel like there's so much information that we can really expand on and get benefit out of. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I can talk about this for a long time as well. I appreciate you.
Cool. Thanks, Bethany. Thank you for joining us on The Focused View, proudly presented by Opticare. It's been our privilege to share the insights and stories that resonate deeply with the eye care community. We hope today's episode has not only inspired you, but also armed you with the practical strategies and innovative ideas to help you enhance your practice and professional journey. If you found value in our conversation, we'd be grateful if you could leave us a 5-star review on your preferred podcast platform. And share this episode with your colleagues. It helps us reach more eye care professionals like you and grow our community of visionaries. Stay connected by subscribing to The Focused View and visiting our website www.thefocusedview.com.au for additional resources and episode summaries. We look forward to your company again in our next episode. Until then, keep focused. I'm Michael Nasser. Bye for now.